We begin with the new impeachment question that has entered the presidential campaign this weekend. Should Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh be impeached? At least 6 Democratic presidential candidates say yes. Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden say there should be an investigation of Brett Kavanaugh, with Joe Biden saying, quote, "We must follow the evidence to wherever it leads." And presidential candidate Amy Klobuchar, who was one of the Democrats who questioned Brett Kavanaugh in his Senate confirmation hearing, is now demanding that the White House and Attorney General William Barr hand over materials from the FBI background investigation of Brett Kavanaugh. In a letter to the White House and the Attorney General, Senator Klobuchar says recent reports have again cast doubts on the completeness of the investigative process, raising additional questions as to whether certain information was followed up on and whether potential witnesses were interviewed. The recent reports Senator Klobuchar refers to are the work of our first guests tonight, New York Times reporters Robin Pogrebin and Kate Kelly, who published an article in the New York Times Sunday edition that was posted online Saturday night, which is an edited excerpt of their new book that will be published tomorrow, The Education of Brett Kavanaugh, an Investigation. The article in the New York Times was apparently enough for some of the presidential candidates to call for impeachment. The article in the Times concentrates on what Deborah Ramirez says happened to her when she was a student at Yale College with Brett Kavanaugh, and what happened to her when she told her story to the FBI during the Brett Kavanaugh background investigation. Deborah Ramirez's story first appeared in The New Yorker during the Kavanaugh confirmation process. Here is her Brett Kavanaugh story as it appears in the new book that will be published tomorrow. During the drinking game, Ramirez said the guys kept picking her to drink more, and she became inebriated. At one point, someone strapped on a fake penis and pointed it at her. Then later, Ramirez said she had a penis thrust in her face. She remembered pushing it away and saying, "That's not a real penis, but this penis was real," and she would recall she had accidentally touched one for the first time. It was something she hadn't planned to do until she was married. She remembered Genda and Todd laughing at her confusion that evening, and Kavanaugh pulling up his pants, looking puffed up like he just did something really, really great, and tilting his head back, also laughing. She remembered hearing David White yell down the hall, "Brett Kavanaugh just put his penis in Debbie's face." After that story first became public in The New Yorker, the Judiciary Committee did not ask Deborah Ramirez to testify. And then the chairman of the committee, Chuck Grassley, said, "There is no corroboration of the allegations made by Dr. Ford or Ms. Ramirez." He was referring to, of course, Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, who did tell her story to the committee under oath in a nationally televised hearing. In their new reporting, Robin Pogrebin and Kate Kelly say Ms. Ramirez's legal team gave the FBI a list of at least 25 individuals who may have had corroborating evidence, but the Bureau, in its supplemental background investigation, interviewed none of them, though we learned many of these potential witnesses tried in vain to reach the FBI on their own. 2 FBI agents interviewed Ms. Ramirez, telling her that they found her credible, but the Republican-controlled Senate had imposed strict limits on the investigation. "We have to wait to get authorization to do anything else," Bill Pittard, one of Ms. Ramirez's lawyers, recalled the agents, saying it was almost a little apologetic. This weekend's New York Times article and the book contain a new revelation about another story that came to the attention of some of the members of the Judiciary Committee at the time, but was never made public during the confirmation process. This story occupies less than 1 page of the book and only 1 paragraph of this weekend's New York Times article. Here is that paragraph from the Times. We also uncovered a previously unreported story about Mr. Kavanaugh in his freshman year that echoes Ms. Ramirez's allegation. A classmate, Max Stier, saw Mr. Kavanaugh with his pants down at a different drunken dorm party where friends pushed his penis into the hand of a female student. Mr. Stier, who runs a nonprofit organization in Washington, notified senators and the FBI about this account, but the FBI did not investigate, and Mr. Stier has declined to discuss it publicly. We corroborated the story with 2 officials who have communicated with Mr. Steyer. NBC News has confirmed that members of the Judiciary Committee were aware of Max Steyer's allegations at the time of the confirmation process. The new book makes one more important point about that story. The book gives the name of the woman involved in that story and then specifies that she, quote, has also refused to discuss the incident, though several of her friends said she does not recall it. The Times later on Sunday added that line to the end of the paragraph about Max Steyer's accusation. That line in the Times now reads, the female student declined to be interviewed and friends say she does not recall the episode. Leading off our discussion tonight are Robin Pogrebin, culture reporter for the New York Times, and Kate Kelly, who writes about Wall Street for the New York Times. They are the authors of the new book, The Education of Brett Kavanaugh, an investigation which will be out tomorrow. First of all, let's start with what happened at the New York Times. What happened with that omission that the Times later felt belonged in the piece?
Well, first of all, Lawrence, there was zero intent to mislead anybody about the details of the incident. That excerpt that we ran in the Times was an adaptation of what's in our book that you just described so aptly. It really focuses on the experience of Deborah Ramirez, as we understand it, after Robin spending quite a bit of time with her, why the incident she alleged to have occurred with Kavanaugh hit so hard for her. She was feeling like a fish out of water that first year at Yale to begin with for any number of reasons, socioeconomic, cultural, and so on. And this incident was deeply traumatizing for her. That was the focus of the piece. We included the additional detail about this other as yet unreported allegation because it seemed germane to the type of thing we were talking about. It was a somewhat similar incident.
In your draft of the article, did it include those words that have since been added to the article?
It did.
It did. So somewhere in the editing process, those words were trimmed.
Yeah, I mean, I think what happened actually was that, we had her name, and the Times doesn't usually include the name of the victim. And so I think in this case, the editors felt like maybe it was probably better to remove it. And in removing her name, they removed the other reference to the fact that she didn't remember it.
Okay, so the way, in your draft for the Times, you used basically the exact words that are in the book that I deliberately left off the name because that passage begins with the name.
Yes.
And so in their removal of the name, they ended up removing
the whole
what follows it.
Yes. And so I think it was just sort of an editing, done in the haste in the editing process, as you know, for closing the section.
Were you involved in the decision to amend this and do the correction on the addition online to the piece?
We discussed it. Yeah. I mean, I think we felt like there was so much heat. There's so much, everyone has been kind of seizing on various aspects of this that we certainly didn't want this to be an issue anymore. And we certainly never intended to mislead in any way. We wanted to give as full a story as possible.
And the key point here is this was a piece of our book that we were sharing through the Times. And the hope was that people will look at the book, which has a much fuller context, not only about this allegation, about, frankly, which not a whole lot is known. We're sharing what we do know, but also about all the context around these allegations in general, the situation at Yale when Justice Kavanaugh was a student there and Robin was a student there, all the corroboration around the Ramirez account that you spoke of. It's all in there, and we really tried to look at things from a 360-degree perspective.
Let me just do one more point on this amendment in the online version of the article. When they were working on what they were going to add to it and the editor's note that they put in, did anyone consider including the fact that it was in your original draft of the article? That would have been clarifying for people who were wondering how this happened. Did they at any point consider including what you just told us in that editor's note?
I'm not sure if they did or not, honestly, but I think the desire was just to get the information out there to the readers, not to focus too much on the process, because obviously there had been an error of judgment that was being addressed, and just to move on to give people the information they needed, but also to remind people that this is an adaptation of a much longer work that's forthcoming.
Do you know why Max Steyer did not talk to you, would refuse to do interviews with you about that
My
story?
sense is that Max Steyer feels as if he did his duty, which was he brought the information that he had to the Senate, to senators, and to the FBI. He made them all very aware that he had this experience that he had witnessed firsthand in a dorm room during his freshman year at Yale. What they did with that information was then up to them. It never actually materialized and became part of the process. Brett Kavanaugh was confirmed, and he was done. His work had been done. He had done his part, and he had no interest in revisiting it.
In the article, you say that Brett Kavanaugh didn't agree to an interview because you couldn't agree to terms for the interview. What terms did he want?
We had some back and forth with the Supreme Court spokesperson about this, and ultimately he wanted to be able to have us say that he declined to comment for the book, and we just weren't comfortable doing that if we were going to have any sort of a meeting with him.
And to Deborah Ramirez, this story is a cultural story. It's the kids from different backgrounds who find themselves at Yale, and she felt disconnected from the start. And then this experience, as she tells it in the book, completely changes her sense of her position at Yale with these people.
I think what's important is that, it was important for us to really flesh out her story. One, because it was never fully told or explored. She never testified. We never had the chance to kind of hear from people who were trying to reach the FBI, who had corroborating evidence to the extent that they had heard about this event contemporaneously, as well as, she had told her mother. We never really learned that. And her mother thought she'd been raped. She was so upset about the experience, although Debbie didn't tell her the details at the time. So we wanted to do that. But I think it was also important to say that it's easy to minimize these allegations and also to look at them as piling on with Kavanaugh when you had a lot of allegations coming fast and furious, and to really sort of say that you have to contextualize this woman's experience in order to understand why this was formative. For some people, it would not have been necessarily a big deal at the party. For her, it was, because it confirmed a sense of inadequacy she had coming into Yale in the first place. Socioeconomically, she was at a disadvantage. She was a person of color. She didn't necessarily, it was not a seamless transition for her the way it was for others. Frankly, it was easier for me, I think, coming from a private school in New York than it was for, a lot of other kids coming into Yale from different backgrounds.
Kate, having worked in the Senate as I did and as the staff director of a committee, as soon as they announced that they were going to reopen the FBI investigation and that the FBI investigation was time limited to a very few number of days, that was a very clear expression to everyone in the Senate. This is going to be an extremely limited investigation. There was another announcement they could have made, which is we're delaying the hearing until the FBI investigation is completed, which would be the normal process for a committee. But once they time limited it, what I'm discovering in your book, though shocking, isn't really surprising to me. The FBI didn't investigate all sorts of obvious people and question all sorts of obvious people they should have questioned.
Right. Part of the consensus that was struck, or rather the compromise that was struck between Senator Flake at the time, Senator Coons, and also with the support of Senators Collins and Murkowski, who, of course, are the sort of moderate Republicans, was that it would be time limited, it would be focused. The four of them actually did talk together about how many witnesses and ideas of which witnesses perhaps ought to be talked to. One person we talked to for the book said that number might be as high as 50. Another said not 50, but double digits. But in any case, it appeared that the White House, which was essentially the client in this FBI investigation, had mandated just 4 interviews with key parties from the alleged Ford incident. Ultimately, that list grew to 10, but we both spoke to numerous people from Justice Kavanaugh's high school, as well as Yale, and other parts of his life as well, who contacted the FBI. There was a school teacher who was in his class at Georgetown Prep in San Francisco, took a day off, prepared a letter, worked with a lawyer, went to the FBI office there, was turned away, was told to call the tip line, was told to file an online form. He did all of these things, and there was no follow-up. He felt that he was never heard. He was extremely frustrated. And we heard this story over and over again from people. This is also a version of what happened to Max Stier, although perhaps because of his stature in Washington, he had more direct contact with lawmakers.
Yeah, we now have reports that he had direct contact with Senator Coons and others. He knew them. They knew him. They had a sense of his credibility. I want to talk about one of the most surprising things that I read here, which is literally the last line of the New York Times article. And this is Deborah Ramirez. Because after what you just talked about, and this very frustrating experience with the FBI, you've talked to a lot of people who are bitter and angry about the way this investigation went and didn't include them. And she says, you can't look at justice as just the confirmation vote. Deborah Ramirez said, there is so much good that came out of it. There is so much more good to come. What did she mean by the good?
I think in the case of Christine Blasey Ford, this experience is one that she may have regretted coming forward, given what she's been through personally and continues to go through in terms of just her family and how this has upended her life. I think perhaps because Deborah Ramirez didn't testify and wasn't sort of publicly vilified, she got the same outpouring of support that Christine Blasey Ford got, but kind of without the downside quite as much. I mean, certainly there were threatening, emails and texts and that kind of thing. But generally, she, was very much sort of buoyed by people coming out of the woodwork saying, you made me, feel validated, my experience. I went through what you went through. You're a hero for coming forward. Men who are talking to their sons in a different way said they were, she made them sort of newly sensitive to this kind of an experience. And so I think that's been her takeaway, is that people have started to talk about these issues and started to be more sensitive to them in a way that hopefully will be lasting.
And Kate, it also reads as if she felt more connected to her Yale classmates in their flow of support toward her than she did when she was there as a student. Right.
It's so interesting, and this is part of the beauty of Robin's reporting and writing, because she really dug down on the Ramirez situation. I mean, she went from feeling rejected by one group of students at Yale in your class to feeling really supported by another, even larger group beyond just the class of '87 and encompassing many more people. And so she does have this sense of optimism that's really buoying for other people, too, because on the whole, this has been a very sad chapter.
Thank you very much for joining us. This is a very personal book. There's a lot of material that I didn't get to. The book ends with your own personal reactions to everything that you've learned, and I hope people read it. It really is a really impressive piece of work. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Robin Blagruben, Kate Kelly, really appreciate it. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.